Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. Damien, you're up this week.
Yes.
What are you bringing to the table today?
So I have brought a piece from Inquest to the table for us to talk about today. This is actually the third of a 6-part series in Inquest that we have been making our way through these past couple of months. That series is called Abolitionist Lessons from the Prison Belt, and it features conversations by Lydia Pelot-Hobbs, Judah Schept, Craig Gilmore, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, sharing just their great wisdom and analysis and lessons learned in the struggle and the fight for abolition, particularly across local and regional networks, but even at the national level. And so the piece that we read for today is called Custody and Power. And it was yet another incredible conversation between these great scholars and scholar activists. Mm-hmm. And I'm actually really grateful to Ruth because she initiated the conversation with some pretty great questions that guided their entire conversation in this piece. And so I was thinking that would be a great place to start and to kick off our conversation today. So thanks to Ruth for that. So she says, quote, "Today we're returning to our discussion of carceral geography to focus on custody. Specifically, how the various powerful forces that hold people against their will organize themselves to be able to do that. Rather than take for granted that, for example, counties can build jails and hold people in them, we should ask how. Where does the revenue come from? How do they get it? What are the vulnerabilities and liabilities? What can we do about them? Who gives authority to do what? In short, how do we organize our curiosity and maintain our astonishment toward developing concrete research for strategy and action?" I loved all those questions.
Yeah.
They were pretty great. And like I said, those conversations, I think, really helped guide the conversation that they had in this piece. And it also included they included and talked about some great examples and case studies, if you will, from places like California, Kentucky, Shreveport, Louisiana, Bloomington, Indiana, and New York City. I think I got them all. And so, there's a lot jam-packed into this conversation that we could talk about. But let's get into it. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I thought this was really great insight into the different ways that the carceral system moves as a system.
Yes.
And those questions from Ruth Wilson Gilmore are great. And I appreciate the context she uses to set those questions up, that this is not something we need to take for granted.
Yeah.
Prisons are not inevitable. It works because there's a process. And how we understand that process both globally and locally helps us find ways to unravel and siphon power away from it.
Yes.
That's really powerful for both the prison industrial complex, but also most things in our lives. There's so many processes and systems that we take at face value without questioning how they work or how they could work differently or how they could maybe just go away and be replaced with something else entirely.
Yes.
And this kind of thinking, asking really deep questions about how the world around us works. I think this is something that abolition has helped me develop. This kind of a skill around that. So I'm always grateful to learn more about abolition of the prison industrial complex because it gives me new depth to explore about the systems around me, whether that's something super local or something even bigger. All these things that happen, they're not inevitable. They happen because they were created at some point to exist in the way that they do.
Yeah, I love that. I think, there's a lot of applicability about that to what they're talking about in this conversation, this 6-part conversation around the prison industrial complex. But you're right. Abolition gives us the keys to and has invited us to ask those questions about other systems as well. And so, I love that. Very good. So this was great. One of the fascinating parts of their conversation and lesson that they shared was about this concept of the political economic geography of unfreedom.
Yeah.
Which is not a concept I had heard named in this way before, right? And so I appreciate them for sharing it. And they gave a couple of great examples of how important it is in abolitionist organizing work to understand who has the power to organize said political economic geography of unfreedom in order for our organizing efforts to be effective, to be the most effective. And so the example that Lydia Pelot-Hobbs shares about Shreveport, Louisiana in the 70s was really great and fascinating to me. So she said, quote, When Louisiana was trying to find places for new prisons in the 1970s, they went searching for surplus state property. In Shreveport, they found this shuttered, segregated black high school that had recently been made surplus due to desegregation. Because it had been a school, the property was still under the jurisdiction of the local school board, which had final say on allotting the land and buildings to the Department of Corrections. Residents succeeded in getting the school board to say, no, we don't want this to be a prison. Among the lessons there, it is so important to always pinpoint who has the relevant decision-making power. It might be something like a school board that you would have never had considered that you now need to campaign around. Because so many institutions need to align to make a prison or jail happen, there's often more than one place to intervene to stop it, and it's important to know how to look for and think about what to prioritize. And that makes so much sense, right? The idea of having to go to the school board because they were the entity or that had the power to give this school over and the land over to the Department of Corrections, it's just not something I would have considered. It's like this, they're trying to turn this into a prison. Where do we go from here? But it's like, who is the they? And that's part of going back to the great questions that started this conversation. And so their conversation then goes on to share how it might not always be as straightforward as, it's the school board that has the decision-making power, which is also another great point around this. And so for me, that was a really great lesson and takeaway, and especially for organizers engaged in this kind of work in their local or regional areas.
Yeah, I think that's a really important lesson. And the power mapping process is so important in understanding how you can oppose, and it's way less straightforward than it sounds.
Yeah.
Like,
oh, absolutely.
Just saying, we're going to map the power making process. It's way more complicated. You have to dive into a lot of different aspects of governing bodies and decision making powers and all that stuff, like this Louisiana example.
Yeah.
And so Craig says in response to Lydia's point here that, quote, pinpointing who has power locally is crucial, but not always straightforward. There are dozens of meetings of local authorities that you could start going to if you want to oppose a new jail or prison plan. How does an organizer who's new to this kind of work find out who actually has the power to stop a project or delay it or demand changes? Is it hit or miss, or can you go somewhere to get a map? Who do you call? And then he talks about how Ruth's work of mapping the prison system in California has been so valuable, and to the organizing work in California of reducing the power of the prison system there.
Right.
And then he makes this point, quote, but the idea of starting from scratch is hard. Often in the course of organizing, I would go into a town and I would say, who's on your city council? They'd go, well, our local guy is Joe. I don't know the other people. And that was the level of what they knew about local decision making. And I think there's a lot in that, and a lot in the previous quote that I brought in too. One layer, as I pointed out earlier, is based on those questions from Ruth. We don't understand how local government works always, because there's a lot of reasons for that. Partly is the education, lack thereof, of understanding how the local stuff works.
Yep.
But we think it's inevitable.
Right.
We think that it's just going to happen, or it feels that it's inevitable.
Yep.
And these are systems that work, and they do whatever they do, and out the other end comes a prison or a school or whatever.
And maybe that's beyond our control, right?
Yeah, and so it feels distant. It feels distant. It feels inevitable. It feels outside of our control or influence.
Right.
And so that's one layer. And another layer is that you've got to know all the players to be able to negotiate or put pressure on them or get information to them in a way that they'll receive it.
Yes.
Because if you're trying to block the school board in Shreveport from giving that land that was a school to the Department of Corrections for a prison, you have to know who those players are and understand what their perspectives are in saying, no, how do we get them to move into saying no?
Yes.
And if you only know you're one person who's local, it's harder to negotiate that, because you're then relying on them to do the work inside the council, which is fraught. And, you've got to do the work across the whole body.
A whole body. And you've got to show up too. So part of this is also understanding where are those meetings, when do they meet, how often do they meet, where do they meet, all of that good stuff too. And so, there's a lot of layers there. And I really so appreciated, you said it was Craig responding to Ruth there, and the work that Ruth's organization did in California. And he gave her some really great credit there. And I think part of what's really amazing about this series is the lessons, the practical takeaways, the lessons that this series offers and their conversations offer to organizers and organizations in their work. And I also think that's true not just for those folks, but for all of us, whether or not you're engaged in abolitionist movement work. And so one of the lessons that Judah sort of started to share was he referred to it as movement memory, this idea of how it's important to record and preserve the history and the work of your efforts in order for future generations to have it to reference and to learn from and to build upon in the work. And so, this came up because Ruth shared a great story with the group. So she says, quote, Melissa Birch, who organized the Critical Resistance South Conference, said on a panel that reflected on that effort 15 years after the founding meeting that if there was one thing she wished she had done differently, it's that, quote, I wouldn't have left. I should have stayed, end quote. Why? Because of all she had learned about the region over her time organizing critical resistance's work in the South. The knowledge didn't have to leave with her, but I suppose what left was specific situated energy and commitment. One person who had been a very young member of the Critical Resistance South Central Committee said, quote, oh, I wish there had been more documentation, end quote. This remark by a smart and resourceful person compelled me to think about how so much of our campaigns and conferences and other movement practices have actually been very well documented, but we haven't been as disciplined as helping people be aware of and use them. Mm-hmm. And then in response to what Ruth said, Judah jumps in and says, quote, that kind of long-term and local movement memory is so important and can also shape our sense of the politics of a place. Abolitionist organizing in Central Appalachia has a much longer history than the fight against the prison in Lecter County. So the documentation is there to be found and to help us make sense of our present.
Yeah.
And so again, I think that kind of practical wisdom is really important and a huge takeaway from all of this. And we've talked about this before. This work is a long journey. Right? And we enter it, young people enter it at a particular point in its timeline, but it has been happening since the ancestors, since the beginning of time. And so this idea of movement memory is really important. How are we documenting our work? How are we sharing it? How are we bringing young people into the fold and sharing that history to keep that legacy and that fight moving forward in a productive way?
Yeah, it's such an important lesson and thing to practice, because the work is intergenerational.
Yes.
And I mean that both literally and metaphorically, because you have generations of leadership that change within a generation of people. It's not just people turning over and growing old and aging out, whatever. It's we're shifting leadership. We're transferring the organizing work.
And we're working together.
Yeah. And, that's the stuff that can get lost.
Yeah.
But that work is so important. And it's not just the documentation you leave behind, but how you help new people connect to it and making sure they know what resources they have available to them.
Yes.
As Ruth pointed out in that story. Because if your work doesn't have space for digging into old files or from before you were there in the work with this org, then how would you know what you have at your disposal?
That's right.
One of the things that Ruth says in the context of this is how Lenin said that professional revolutionaries are important. And that gave me some pause because I hadn't heard that put in that exact way before. But all the things that our formal workplaces have developed as a way to bring new people into the organization or have continuity in the work in some kind of way, those are things that I'm guessing a professional revolutionary might bring to the work.
Yes.
It's the documentation, but it's also the transfer and explanation of the documentation to the next person. And so it's not about, as Ruth says, people drawing paychecks. It's about the extra layers of documentation and transition and project management and that kind of stuff that somebody could bring into the work to make sure that the work continues effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think about, and we talk about this often in our, in our day jobs, this idea of onboarding people and training them and bringing them into the organization. That same work that we do in our professional lives applies here as well. It's super important for, again, the continuity of the organizing work and the effectiveness of the work.
Yeah, and how you organize your information too is a big part of it, especially now. I mean, it's always been important, but I think digital clutter is a real thing, and how to navigate the digital clutter is and no, that's nobody's, when you're creating an organization, that's nobody's first thought.
No.
How do we keep this organized outside of maybe, we'll have some folders and a shared drive or whatever, but that's not necessarily the sexy part of trying to keep things running and moving, because there's other stuff that's in front of you need to take care of.
Right. It's pressing issues and work that you feel like has to be done, but this is such a critical part of it, I think, an important part of it. Okay, you're kind of talking a little bit about how this applies to real world stuff. So let's shift our conversation over to application and, how does this piece and their conversation apply to our everyday lives and work? My application comes from something that Judah says in this conversation about that political economic geography of unfreedom concept that I talked about earlier. So he says, quote, "The first was this prison in Floyd County called Southeastern Correctional Complex. It was formerly known as Otter Creek Correctional Center and was built by a private prison company in the early 1990s and then sold to Core Civic, then CCA, which operated it for 20 years. There were a lot of scandals and abuses during those decades, and the prison had a variety of different kinds of custody arrangements. At one point, it imprisoned women from Hawaii, 5,000 miles away from home. I raise it here just to make the point that you all have made for many years, which is that the focus on custody within private prisons, as though their profit motives drive mass incarceration, is a bit of a ruse. Kentucky ended its contract with Core Civic in 2012 and closed Otter Creek. And yet, of course, the prison just remained in the community. And in fact, Kentucky reopened, repurposed, and renamed it as a state prison 7 years later. There are now 800 Kentuckians incarcerated within it. In other words, the issue is the prison itself, rather than the company or agency that owns it. In fact, the expansive carceral geography of Kentucky is thoroughly a question of the state. And there's so much in that statement. But I was particularly struck by his statement that the issue is the prison itself, because I think that's 100% correct. The issue is the prison itself. And we see that through the examples that they talk about in this conversation, including Judah's example here about Kentucky, that the state will always find a way to make use of a prison or a jail or a facility, what have you. And so we have to recognize that the issue is the prison, it's the building, and we simply do not need these degrading, life-harming, death-making institutions, period, full stop. And I think it's connected to this idea that I read recently, like all carceral violence in all of its forms is straight up unjustifiable. And so for me, this conversation just continues to reinforce the case for abolition, obviously. What about you?
Yeah, I think that's great application. And it's the building and it's all of the things tied to the building and its existence, all the systems that put people there. All of that stuff is what you talk about carceral violence being unjustifiable. It's all
connected.
Yeah, it's all a big network of carcerality. Political economy of unfreedom. Yeah. All right, that's great application. Mine comes from Craig, and he builds on Judah's point. And he's talking about the prison industrial complex creates a lot of labels for people. And so he says, quote, "The political geography of carcerality doesn't simply make a distinction between the innocent and the guilty. It also divides the guilty into various groups and incarcerates them and surveils them differently, which makes movement building more difficult. It's like these people deserve treatment. These people deserve to be locked up forever. These people are our neighbors. These people are not our neighbors. It plays people against each other across a bunch of different divides. It's something we and our readers need to be aware of, both as opportunities to organize and as traps not to fall into."
I love that.
Yeah, it's so important to unpack, because if we notice those kinds of patterns, I think we see them in other places in our society, like our schools. And then Ruth kind of adds on to this point by saying that prisons are, quote, sorting and stacking machines. It's useful to think this way without presuming the sorting and stacking is predetermined and fixed or mechanistic. Rather, the hierarchies produced by the sorting and stacking, arising as they do as not just in highly differentiated geographies, resolve into new geographies of power and difference, opening opportunities in the context of the very crises that provoke establishment or renovation of institutional forces in the first place. And if those geographies remain carceral, emancipation remains unfinished.
Wow.
Yeah, so when we continue to create these geographies of power and difference in the prison industrial complex or in any realm in our society, we're avoiding and denying true emancipation and that project moving forward.
Absolutely. Oh, that's some deep stuff there. And all of it to me centers around this idea of humanity. And so I love both of those points together. Well done to bring them together. But this idea that, we can't other people, we can't, everyone deserves life and love and freedom, right? Period. And so, those points together, I think, work really well.
Yeah.
And are great application. Very good. All right, well, let's move on to homework. What do we want to do to continue our learning and unlearning work once we leave the table today? One of the things that Ruth mentioned when talking about her prison abolition organizing work in California was how the organization she was part of screened a 1999 documentary film called Yes in My Backyard, which I looked it up. It explores rural America's dependence on the prison industry using New York as a case study. And obviously it's a little old now, but I'd still like to check that out if we can track it down somewhere. Maybe Canopy has it or something like that. Yeah. So that's just one idea for homework. And the other, obviously, is that we've got to finish this series because it's been incredible. So 3 down, 3 to go.
Yeah.
What about you?
My homework is to keep reading this series because it's been really informative with some really deep analysis and practical wisdom sort of weaving throughout the whole conversation. So looking forward to continuing to read this.
I love it. Very good. All right. Well, that's our conversation about part 3 of this incredible series. I hope you're reading it along with us. But Aaron, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
I'm bringing our November book to the table.
Woohoo!
It's called Read This When Things Fall Apart, Letters to Activists in Crisis. And I know what you're thinking. Didn't you just have a book on the podcast in the last episode? Yes, that would be correct.
Yes.
Yeah. We've been reading up a storm.
Yes.
I guess. But this book is edited by Kelly Hayes, who co-wrote Let This Radicalize You with Miriam Kaba. And Kelly also hosts an incredible podcast called Movement Memos, which is published by Truth Out.
Right.
And this book is full of 21 letters about everything from grief to being a parent and feeling isolated to having been assaulted to fighting fascism and a lot more. So I'm looking forward to talking about those lessons that we're taking away from this book next week. And I think it's going to be a big challenge because more than half of these letters, I think, could be their own episode.
Yes.
So I also want to thank the generous folks at AK Press for sending us a couple of advanced reading copies so that we could read this and release an episode about it before the book comes out, which I believe it comes out yesterday as you're listening to this on release day.
Yes.
So November 4th is release day for the book. So grab a copy from AK Press to learn and unlearn along with us.
It was fascinating. It was like a beautiful mind watching you figure out the dates there, and you nailed it because I was like, I don't know, I don't remember. So yes, many thanks to AK Press for that. And I agree, this book has been amazing. And the letters that these activists and organizers wrote have just been so moving and brilliant. And they acknowledge in some of the places that, some of these letters may not apply to you specifically or your situation, but they're still important to read and to know. And it may be comrades that are impacted by these situations that they have found themselves in. And I'm getting ahead of ourselves. This is next week's conversation, but I have loved this book. I'm almost done, and I'm so excited to chat about it next time. Very good. All right. Well, folks, with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what we want you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes, thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.